Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today we're going to go to Georgia. We're going to a big farm, which has a wonderful college on it called Berry College. And we're going to talk to a professor of biology there, Professor Bruce Kahn. And he is an entomologist. But in addition, I understand he's very interested in clams and bivalves and things that have shells. So we've been talking about the dangers of eating oysters that don't have the right things in them. So I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Kahn. Hi, how are you?
Hello, I'm very good, Meta, and thank you for inviting me.
That you have an undergraduate program in One Health at Berry College. Tell me a little about that first.
Okay, I'd love to tell you about that. That was something that actually we developed a few years ago. I was the dean of the school here at the college, the School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences, and we were always looking for very important new fields that were coming along that could actually be done better on our campus than most places. And because of the farm, for example, that you just mentioned, we felt that we were in a good place to offer a program in One Health because our students, every student at Berry College has the opportunity is guaranteed to be able to work a job on campus. And many of those jobs are in our animal units, in our agriculture units. So we have an equine center, we have a very active dairy producing cheese and milk. We have also a beef operation, horticultural operations, and even a few sheep and goats here and there.
Wow.
In addition to that, Berry College is the largest university campus in the world with about 28,000 acres or about 108 square kilometers of campus. And so we have tremendous wildlife populations, then in addition to very nice modern laboratories. So with having all of those things, we felt that we were in a perfect position to offer an outstanding program where we did what One Health does, and that is to integrate animal health, human health, as well as the environmental health. We have 2 rivers that run on our campus, as well as lakes and streams and so on. So we add to that the fact that we are just a little over an hour drive from Atlanta and have very good working relations with the folks at the Centers for Disease Control. And the Centers for Disease Control, of course, has a very strong program in One Health there. And some of the CDC research teams actually work with us on our campus doing research on things like on tick populations, for example. Ticks, as you know, are very important at spreading certain types of diseases, both among humans and animals. And so with all of these strengths in the area, it just seemed like a very natural fit. And indeed, it has done very well. Many of our students are working on majors in One Health. And what they do is they choose either veterinary science or human-oriented science or environmental science. Mm-hmm. And then so they take that particular subset of the One Health experience and apply it to their program.
Well, where do most of them go after they finish it?
It's very broad, and there's a lot of variety available. So a lot of our students, because we have a very strong animal science program, we have a very good track record of getting students into veterinary school. So about a dozen or so of our students will go to vet school after they leave here. Berry is primarily an undergraduate institution, so we focus on that. So many will go into veterinary school and will continue their interest in One Health there. We have a lot of students also who go into medical school, but we also have quite a few who go to jobs in industries, the biotech industry and the pharmaceutical industry as researchers or as, beginning people in those careers. We also have a number who will go into the federal and state wildlife agencies or conservation agencies. And so they pretty much cover a wide gamut of those fields. And with all of those, they're bringing that One Health emphasis.
So tell me about your research. I noticed, I Googled you, and there was something about you had been in I didn't get very far with my Googling, but that you'd been doing research in Asia.
We tend to build teams across many institutions, and then we tend to build teams across different disciplines. The work in Asia, I actually probably have done less work in Asia than in some other areas, but I also have programs going in Africa, in Europe, South America, a lot of work in the Caribbean, quite a bit of work actually in Canada. Canada is where I kind of got my start, even as a young undergraduate myself, on a
Where?
program up there, up in New Brunswick. So
Really? Okay.
I was lucky as an undergraduate in a kind of college in Tennessee to get a fellowship to come and spend the summer doing research on marine biology in New Brunswick, St. Andrews. And so I have been working with Canadian colleagues ever since. But basically, what we do is we will look at, just like One Health is the attempt to integrate across disciplines, it's also got to be an area to integrate across geography. Most of the important diseases like COVID-19 that come along, and now monkeypox, of course, and other things that I have worked more directly with, like the Zika virus outbreak, that is a mosquito-borne disease. These are diseases that do cause pandemics or have the potential to do so, and that exist around the world. And so you talked about the social sciences and sociology. That's a very important part of One Health. We have to understand demographics. We have to understand when and where and why people move and what they're moving with them as they move.
Mhm.
And so in all of those, including the Asian work, we are looking at movement patterns, not only for humans, but for animals, either as pets or as livestock or as a black market. A lot of animal movement is in black markets.
Mhm.
And we also look a lot at vectors. So mosquitoes do occupy a lot of my time these days. And right now here in the United States and in southern Canada, we of course have two very important disease vectors, Aedes albopictus and Aedes japonicus. Both of those are Asian mosquitoes that were
Hold
introduced
on.
in North
Now,
America.
you've mentioned two things I never heard of before.
Mhm.
Around me, we're having these things. I was just telling somebody a couple of days ago, I've lived here in this apartment for 40 some, close to 50 years, and I've never had a mosquito here.
Mhm.
And my friends say, well, we have mosquitoes. I don't know why I don't have mosquitoes, but I don't think that they live very much around Toronto. Tell me, are there, you say that we've got diseases being transmitted by mosquitoes in Ontario?
Yes, but you are fortunate there because climate does play a role. And number one, you have a lower diversity of mosquitoes in Ontario than you would have farther south.
Mm.
Also, you have, because you've got a colder climate, just because you have a particular mosquito that is competent to vector a particular disease doesn't mean you'll have it spreading in your area. This is where One Health comes in. We've got to understand a lot of different moving parts out there in Mother Nature. And one of those is temperature. So, for example, an encephalitis virus, something like Zika virus that you may recall the news of it breaking out in the Caribbean, South America, moving into especially Florida, the southern U.S. We have a major situation with dengue fever in all the way up to the U.S. border.
Mhm.
Those pathogens require a certain amount of time to develop, even inside the mosquito. If you're in such a cold climate that those mosquitoes in your area don't remain active as feeding adults for long enough, then the chances of the disease being transmitted are very low. So you're fortunate in that. So that there are some great things about having a cold climate
Mhm.
in Toronto, and then I actually work more around the Ottawa area and Montreal. But with those climates, you don't get as much danger for disease transmission. But I was just up in Ontario about 3 weeks ago, and in fact, we found not Aedes albopictus, Aedes japonicus there, an Asian mosquito that was introduced not just from Japan, as the name implies, but other parts of Asia. It is capable in certain areas of carrying Zika virus, chikungunya virus, dengue virus, even yellow fever, but it typically does not once it gets north of the Caribbean.
Hmm. Well, now what are these diseases you say we do have out here that I never heard of the things you've mentioned? What are they?
There are some others that are, for example, you do get West Nile virus. I'm sure you've heard of that.
I've heard of it, but I've never come close to it, I think.
No, probably not. West Nile virus, this is another thing. There are certain things that are more problematic in more rural areas or even more forested or sylvan areas. But there are many diseases that are also specific for more urban habitats. And that happens to be when the disease is spread by synanthropic mosquitoes. That means mosquitoes that just love people. And some of those mosquitoes that I've mentioned, like Aedes albopictus from Asia that has now been introduced here, and the most dreadful of all, Aedes aegypti, which was introduced into North America many centuries ago.
That's the name of the mosquito, not the disease, right?
That's the name of the mosquito. But but see, this is where One Health comes in. You've got to understand the mosquito to understand the disease. So Aedes aegypti, for example, which came from Africa, introduced into North America, it has been found recently in ports like Montreal, but it does not survive very well that far north. It's more of a tropical mosquito, but it's not only tropical, it is an urban mosquito. So you get into the large urban areas of the tropics around the world, and you will find Aedes aegypti there. And it is it's sometimes called the yellow fever mosquito. And of course, yellow fever is one of the most dreadful diseases known to humanity.
Really, I've only heard of it. I've lived I guess a very sheltered life because all of these things are I've never gone near anything that was that pathogenic. What does yellow fever do to you? Or even what's it like?
Yellow fever, you get the name because of the fact that people get a lot of it. Of jaundice. They develop jaundice because the mosquito does immediate damage and severe damage to the liver, to various other organs. Ultimately, it's a major hemorrhagic fever. So it causes you to start bleeding out. Your blood vessels break down. You hemorrhage throughout your body. And historically, a third of the people who get it will die from it. In 1878, even in Memphis, Tennessee, 1 out of every 8 citizens in Memphis, Tennessee died of yellow fever in 1878. That was before we realized that or any disease was spread by mosquitoes. That discovery didn't come around until the late 1800s. And then we had a number of people who became very involved in looking at mosquitoes and found that they also transmitted things like malaria and so on, which still kills close to 1 million children every year in Africa. And they started studying the mosquitoes and controlling those. So in the United States, we were lucky because we are only barely on the northern edge of where the appropriate Anopheles mosquito populations that transmit malaria can exist, and also the Aedes mosquitoes that transmit yellow fever. So it was fairly easy to push out of the United States, which we have done, and that's why you haven't heard of it much anymore. Canada is even luckier, again, in its northerly climate. And by the way, we can segue into the whole idea of what climate change might do to alter some of these patterns. But in the northern area there in Canada, even in the most southerly parts of Ontario, it's not very suitable area for these mosquitoes to thrive. And so you simply don't get them. But just to come back, these Aedes mosquitoes that we're talking about are urban mosquitoes. They like people. They live around people. They breed in water pots and flower pots and rain gutters. They don't need large marshes or wetlands. And so because they live in these cities and in large cities even that are very densely populated by people, once a disease takes off in those areas, it can spread like wildfire. And it often has.
What are the treatments or preventions? Do they have vaccines for things like diseases spread by mosquitoes?
They do. There is, yellow fever is one for which there is a very good vaccine, one that has been available for some time. And people in places like Angola, for example, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa, in Brazil, and parts of Peru where you have these mosquito populations, there are often requirements that people be vaccinated. And so they've been dealing with that sort of thing for a long time. There have even been in those areas travel restrictions based on the vaccine. And in fact, if you go to some of those countries, you would be required to take a yellow fever vaccine to go. And it's quite an effective vaccine. The problem is getting it to cover enough for people in very sometimes remote areas or more difficult cities to reach.
Well, if you had everybody vaccinated, would it be possible to eradicate the disease?
Well, that's a great question. And of course, I think a lot of people have been asking that lately in terms of the COVID. And the answer is, pessimistically, probably would not be possible. And the reason I say that, and it's not really pessimistic, is you have to remember that only one human disease that we know of has ever been truly eradicated on a global level. And that, of course, was smallpox. And smallpox is a very different sort of thing. It does not require mosquito transmission or anything like that. But smallpox was eradicated, but it's the only one. And it's not been for lack of effort. We have put trillions of dollars around the world into trying to develop vaccines against things, for example, like malaria. Malaria remains, according to many people, the most important human health problem in the world, even though if you live in Canada, you hardly hear of it unless a case happens to come in from someone who's been traveling into the tropics. In the United States, we have a little bit of it from time to time, but very little. But we have never had a successful vaccine developed against malaria. It's a much more complicated disease than the viral diseases. It's not a virus. It's a tiny creature small enough to get inside your red blood cell, and yet it's got a genetic capability that rivals your own. And so every time we throw something at it, it finds a way back around it. So it's hard to get a vaccine to begin with, but then even if you get one, as we've seen with COVID, there are the pathogen, in that case, of course, a coronavirus, it develops variants very quickly. We see the influenza. We've had influenza vaccines for a long time, and yet we still have to get our annual new flu shot, not because of the lack of efficacy for the original vaccine, but the fact that the pathogen, it continues, in that case, a very different kind of virus, it continues to mutate and to change and make itself not susceptible to our most recent version. So
well, I had heard that we were a few years ago that they said we were on the verge of eliminating polio, but here we have it back in the US now. Right.
We do. And polio, we came so very, very close to eradicating polio, actually. Polio is another very difficult disease that you've got to understand the environment to understand how it spreads, how it moves from people through sewage into the water, how it can continue to exist in the water, even among other animals, small microscopic crustaceans and things of this sort in the water. But yes, there has been a new re-emergence of polio recently. And
does anybody know where it came from, or do you have a theory?
Where it came from originally, I'm not familiar. I'm sure people have looked at that. We have almost every major disease. There have been people, especially in this new modern area of genomics, that have been able to sequence their genes and to look at the rate of genetic change and also trace the genetic makeup, let's say, of a strain of a pathogen in Canada compared with the different strains in Africa and in Asia and so forth. And using those sorts of methods now, they've been able to make good guesses, at least, about where things came from, how long they have been out there. But it's a growing science. It's not really refined yet. All we know is that polio has been with us from way back.
Well, I don't mean where it originated, but I meant the importation of polio to the U.S. is surely it must be very localized. You don't have it all over the U.S. Where is it, New York or someplace where they found it in the water?
Typically, it will come in any major port area that receives a lot of immigrants that are coming from places where it has been. So certain parts of, especially the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa. Also, polio has been a big problem in areas around in Central and South Asia, from Bangladesh to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so forth. Those have been where the little holdouts have remained. And so when you have people moving from those areas, you have the potential for it being introduced. Now, in the case of some of these diseases, and this would include polio somewhat, when you move into an area that many of these diseases really concentrate and remain established in third world countries, in third countries with a lot of poverty, with very poor infrastructure, places where people live in substandard housing, where people do not have access to good sewage treatment and so forth. And they flourish in those areas. And a lot of those things come into the United States or into Canada fairly often. I mean, Toronto, for example, is a major, the airport there, you're getting people from all over the world every day. Mm-hmm. And they are, believe me, they're coming in with pathogens that theoretically could infect the rest of the population, but they don't, because Toronto has very modern infrastructure in terms of sewage treatment, water treatment, so on. Also, Toronto has access to the best healthcare available in the world. And so with the combination of all of those things, even if something comes in at a low level, it's usually very easy to pick up and to suppress. Many of these diseases are known as diseases of poverty, and that's where they primarily remain. And so we're blessed in that way in living in a highly developed country. So even when polio, we came close to it, wiping out polio, but it had continued to be established in some of these areas, these poverty.
So it'll be an uphill climb to try to get back to the stage they were in a few years ago, right? If it's spread already in other countries, but I think there's only been one case or so of a person catching it in the U.S. Is that right?
That's right. And what people don't know is that we do have even malaria, for example. You frequently hear people say that malaria has been eliminated from the United States, and it has, but that word elimination, if you look at it in the context of public health jargon, that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means that it is no longer a major human health threat, and that when we do find an area of a small outbreak, we're able to stop it quickly. So even though we say we eliminated malaria from the United States back in the 1950s, we have had about 60 actual outbreaks of malaria in the United States since that time. But they have been limited. They were quickly picked up, and they were quickly put back out. So, and the same thing, of course, would be true with Canada.
Well, see, what I was assuming was that if you got everybody in the world vaccinated, then polio would it be even eliminated from the environment, because I assumed that it needed people to be part of the survival thing. You had to be in a person. Is that true? That's true of malaria, isn't it? That the whole thing requires going through people in order to transmit it. You couldn't get it just from walking in the woods in a swamp.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And again, we get back to this idea of One Health and understanding what's going on in the natural world. I think if you've heard from some of your earlier guests that up to 70%, 65, 70% of all infectious diseases of humans we share with other animals. Mm-hmm. That's not a static number. The reality is that life is constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, constantly adapting, and we have new pathogens actually moving out of animals for the first time into humans. Think of things like Ebola, for example, as something that would be in that category.
That's new. That didn't exist 100 years ago in people.
Well, not that we know of, and that's another thing too. I mean, it may be that Ebola has been cropping up in human populations for centuries, and we just didn't recognize it. So that's another thing that's changing, is our ability to recognize things. But the point is, even malaria, actually a good friend and former student of mine, Stephen Rich, who is a scientist at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He did genomic research on malaria some time ago and came up with a figure that malaria itself entered into the human population, probably I think it was about 30,000 years ago. That malaria, most of the malaria parasites that infect people are pretty exclusive to Homo sapiens, to humans, but they originated in primates. Which is also where the Zika virus came from, which is also where, yellow fever and Ebola and some others came from, primate populations. And now, of course, we have COVID coming at us, as well as not only the COVID-19, the SARS-2, but the original SARS and the MERS, the Middle Eastern version. We've had 3 coronaviruses now coming into the human population from animal populations. And another thing that we do in One Health is we try to figure out where those points of origin are. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, it's always happening. Now, that's not a reason to give up hope and to be dismal. It is probably a reason not to focus as much on eradicating a disease as learning how to control it, learning how, we have not wiped out malaria in the United States, mm-hmm. but we've developed a good ability to when we see a little brush fire of malaria pop up, we can put it out very quickly before it becomes a raging forest fire, mm-hmm. To follow that analogy. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably the more realistic way to think of infectious disease, is learning to control them, not trying to eradicate them.
So you are an entomologist, but you say you're also invertebrate zoologist, which is a big category.
Right.
And you mentioned bivalve shellfish and so on. And I was saying I didn't even know that we had shellfish around here, but you come to the Great Lakes to study them. But also, tell me, let's go back to where we briefly mentioned the seaweed farms that are in the Maritimes of Canada. And this is a kind of a new up and coming thing. Apparently, there's quite a good business for seaweed, and they can raise it along with oysters. And I read someplace that it's a good thing. Not only does seaweed sequester capture a whole lot of carbon, and depending on what you do with it, if you put it underground, you could sequester it. It's probably too expensive to just bury. But the other thing is that the oysters apparently can grow in the same area as the seaweed, and you have 2 crops simultaneously. But the oysters are cleaning the water. Now, I don't know how it cleans the water, but one of my questions was, does somebody then come along and eat the oyster, and do they sell them for people to eat? And if so, how do we know what's a good oyster and what has been used too much to sweep the floor of the ocean?
Mm-hmm. Well, lots of good questions there. I love oysters. I love clams. I love mussels. I love just about any kind of mollusk out there, including squid. And of course, there are a number of snails that are quite good. The thing about bivalve mollusks, that would include oysters, mussels, and clams, is they all are filter feeders. So they are getting their food by filtering it from the water. And depending on where they are, they're filtering different things. So oysters tend to develop in more sedimentary areas. And so they're feeding on a lot of organic material that's washed into the sea from the rivers, as well as the ocean plankton itself. But you've got to remember some things. So, for example, mussels. If you go to the restaurant and have a nice bowl of blue mussels, they tend to attach to hard, rocky substrates, often in very cool waters, and they're not eating as much of the sediment from rivers and land runoff as they're eating the plankton. Remember that the whole surface, 70% of the surface of the globe is ocean, and that ocean water is rich in phytoplankton, in diatoms, and flagellates of various types, living organisms that are not particularly contaminated by human activity on land. So They are often quite clean from human pathogens or other materials, runoff of chemical pollutants, for example. So you've got to be aware of where your shellfish is coming from, therefore what it probably has been eating, and then take it from there. Oysters are, boy, they are so popular in the southern United States. Every other corner you get an oyster bar where people will eat raw oysters. And you can become sick from those and from a variety of things that they have filtered out. I don't want to scare anybody away from them because they really are quite popular and usually are quite safe. But personally, I don't eat raw things.
There's something about don't eat them in months with the letter R in them, or maybe that's when you're supposed to eat them. I don't eat oysters often enough to have memorized it, but what's presumably you get sick, or you're more likely to get sick if you eat them in the wrong month of the year or something.
Well, that could be true because again, they're eating whatever is in the water. They're filtering whatever is in the water, and so you have some of the phytoplankton, for example, that I mentioned. They have certain seasons where they're more likely to go through their blooms, where they're able to produce large crops. So you get things like red tides. So you've all heard if there's a red tide, or if you have along the coast of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, that area, you'll get what's called paralytic shellfish poisoning. The way you handle that is simply you can't stop the mussels and the clams from eating those things, but you can have someone going out, sampling the water, looking for the particular culprits that carry this neurotoxin that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning. And they do. They'll go out and they'll sample, and when those levels reach a certain point, they will put signs up on the beach and say, no, it's not allowed to, not recommended or not allowed, depending on the laws of the particular area, to harvest shellfish during that time. So again,
could shellfish be a preventive or a remediation for eutrophication? Because you say that they eat the stuff that's fallen to the bottom, but is there anybody eating the stuff that's floating on the top? That green slime.
There are most of the things that would be eating things that float on the top. There's a whole class. There are, of course, scientists. We love all our fancy names. So we talk about, for example, the neuston. The neuston, those are the organisms that actually float on the surface. There are lots of different animals that specialize on feeding in the neuston, but most of those, as it turns out, are not commonly circulated back into the human diet. We tend to eat things that are more on the bottom or near the bottom. And so even the fish we eat, we love flounder and halibut. Those are both what we call benthic fish. They live literally on the bottom and they feed on things on the bottom. Then we love codfish and mackerel. Those are called demersal fishes. They don't live on the bottom, but they swim freely in the open water, but very close to the bottom. And so again, they're going to eat things primarily that are on the bottom. But then you get things like tuna and swordfish that are high pelagic fishes that swim high above the surface or the bottom. They have a whole different type of food. So that's one of the reasons that you don't usually worry as much about getting an infection from tuna as you do from a codfish. It's where they feed and what they feed on.
Fascinating.
So again, it brings us back to the idea of One Health. It's if you really want to understand and help keep yourself and the public safe, you've got to understand the whole system. You've got to understand the different components of that system and how they interact with each other, and therefore be able to predict where your points of vulnerability would be.
Mm-hmm. And you teach people to do that as consumers, as part of the One Health program would be to alert them to thinking about things like where their oysters came from. Is that part of it?
Absolutely. And it has been, we're becoming more refined in that. Of course, we have had that sort of thing in place for a long time. And we've made a lot of improvements on, for example, one of the big stories would be trichinella, trichina worms. Half a century ago, trichinosis was a big problem. Now it's hardly a problem at all. in more developed countries. And yet it's still out there, very common in parts of Canada, in parts of the United States, all over the world. But we have learned to avoid eating certain kinds of meats. And we have also learned, for example, the primary source of trichinosis formerly was pork. And yet now in the United States and in Canada, our pork is very, very clean. And we've managed that by understanding how the pigs become infected with those worms, in this case, the trichina worm, and simply changing our agricultural practices to make sure that they are not fed the material that would cause them to become infected.
One of the things I noticed during the a while back during the COVID epidemic, I haven't heard about it lately, was that it seemed that one of the main places where a whole bunch of people would get sick and they'd have to close the plant down was in meatpacking. And it made me wonder, what do they do there that makes them more susceptible to catching coronavirus than somebody working in an office or an automobile factory? Is there some explanation that I need to know about?
Well, I don't think so, but you would probably need to talk to someone else, more of a viral epidemiologist, which I'm not. I work in and around viruses a little bit, but it's just like in the early days of the COVID-19, we saw, of course, the outbreaks in senior care facilities. That was partly because of the natural lower immune competence of very elderly people, especially elderly people who have been institutionalized. But it's also because of the fact that you're in a very closed environment where people are not able to get out and get fresh air, sunshine, and so forth. We now know with it, for example, getting a lot of sunshine, having a high vitamin D level is one of the things that's proven to be very effective as a protection against COVID. But some of those things will turn out to have been actually something related to that industry, like the meatpacking industry. Some of it will turn out probably in the end just to have been accidental. When we look at it, we'll see that, well, there happened to be a couple of outbreaks in situations like that. And it is an area where you've got a lot of people working closely together, as well as animals working closely together, and there's easy transmission of any kind of airborne material. So we're going to continue. I think everyone's been frustrated somewhat by the whole COVID thing over the last 2.5 years. But we're seeing we learned lessons, and a lot of the lessons we learned were that our initial assumptions turned out not to be true. They tend to be, with something brand new like this, certain patterns that seem to exist don't really exist over the long run.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now one of the people that I've talked to about One Health is Laura Kahn, and she has a book some years ago, I think, about, and I don't remember the title, but one of the things that she explored was the way antibiotics, of course, they were feeding, maybe they stopped doing that, I don't know, I'd like for you to tell me that, but they were feeding antibiotics to animals to fatten them up. I can't imagine why that fattens them, but they did. And then apparently what happens is the animals go out and excrete in the pasture, and the antibiotics stay around and change the biome of the pasture. I guess they kill maybe pathogens, but also they kill bacteria that we would love to see stay there. Now, tell me, has this ever turned into a social issue that been taken seriously enough to have medical people or disease control people look at this as a problem to be eliminated by passing rules about the use of antibiotics?
Absolutely. We've been looking at it. It's a very alarming situation. And we, across all of the various medical professions and public health professions, from animal to human and so on, there has been, fortunately, a real push in the last decade or so to eliminate massive use of antibiotics, just to increase the rate that the livestock grow and so on. There are certain benefits to be had, but they are far, as it turns out, far outweighed by the liabilities. One of the, right now in the United States Global Health Initiative, the three biggies, we have three big diseases. They are malaria, which we arrogantly thought we wiped out decades ago, but it's still as entrenched as ever. The other one is HIV, which 50 years ago we didn't even know we had. Okay. And then there is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is another one we thought we had beat a long time ago, and to a certain degree we had. But what we have now with tuberculosis is antibiotic resistant tuberculosis. Is that the bacteria have developed the ability to resist our antibiotics, and so those are coming back, and they're very, very difficult to treat in people. So it's one of our major issues in the world. So this is something that's very alarming. Most responsible farmers, most responsible agricultural businesses are now really reducing the degree to which they use antibiotics. And of course, you even see it on your milk carton. Almost every milk carton you see now, I hope, will say that there are no antibiotics used. You'll get chicken, you'll go to the store, pick up a carton of eggs, and many times now it will say no antibiotics. And this is the reason for it. It is an industry-wide effort to reduce the amount of antibiotics we are just randomly putting out in feed and in other ways, because we're starting to see the danger that it poses.
Why did it, or how did it fatten animals? I was amazed that there was a connection. Do they know?
I'll give you an educated guess. Again, I'm not an expert on that particular thing, but I would suspect, what I do know as someone who studies parasites and other pathogens, we expend a phenomenal amount of our energy budget as organisms fighting disease. I don't know what the percentage actually would be. There have been a few guesstimates on it, but we have an incredibly powerful immune system, and it is very active. And just like anything else, it's like flexing a muscle. Any metabolic activity you engage in is going to take up a lot of energy. It's going to consume the energy from a lot of the food you eat. The same thing is true with cattle and pigs and chickens and everything else. They're constantly out there in the environment. They're constantly encountering pathogens or potential pathogens. And they spend a lot of their energy, maybe 20% of their energy budget, just beneath the surface fighting off these infections. You never see it. You don't even know you even have the infections. Even you and I, right now, there are bacteria living in your body. There are mites living inside your skin. There are other things growing in you and on you. And you are spending a lot of time and effort through your immune system fighting those off more than you realize.
I never thought of it. Germs as weight control measures.
Well, there have actually been a few things that people at least even once proposed using tapeworms.
I was just about to mention. I was just about to mention that. That's the only case I could think of that I didn't even know whether it was anything more than a legend. But there was this. I've heard of people. That they would ask, this kid is eating so much, do you suppose he has a tapeworm? Okay.
Well, it's most people who get really sick lose weight. So it's not just losing weight is not a good thing if it means giving in to some of the things trying to eat you up. The example I use in my classes is we are all sitting there in the class and we all smell pretty good, I hope, if we bathe that morning or that week. But any one of us, if we were to die right now and someone were to throw us out in the woods, it would only be a matter of a couple of days before we would start really smelling bad and our tissues and flesh are falling off. And I say, why is that? Is it because something new happened? No. The only thing that happened is your immune system, you died, so your immune system stopped working. But it's working while you're sitting there in the cafe, on Young Street or wherever you are. Your body is actively, with a lot of energy expenditure, fighting off all the things that would love to be making you rot on the forest floor if you died and were thrown out. So that should tell you that no, there are plenty of things out there. There are hundreds of things that would love to just eat you. You're just a nice big fat source of nutrients for them, and you fight them off nonstop. Through your immune system. Mm-hmm. And so that uses a lot of energy. So back to the original question, if you could put antibiotics in and kill all of these little things, so that the animal's immune system no longer has to be expending this large amount of energy to fight off the disease. Then they can put more of that energy into just building more muscle or whatever to make steaks or pork chops. So in the end, it's a bad idea, but it actually makes sense why it would work.
Yeah. Well, then there's this whole thing about the good bacteria that we don't want to kill. And I presume that the whatever kills one bacterium is liable to kill them all. So you don't want to, you can't pick and choose which ones you want to kill off. Or maybe they will get to that point, but are they doing so now?
Well, there's an attempt to, but it's very difficult. It's the same thing with controlling insect pests. Any kind of insecticide you put out there is going to kill a lot of things. Not just, you go all the way back to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and so forth. We had to learn the hard way that yes, these pesticides are great in some ways, but they also have a very, very negative side. And it's because most living things do ultimately have a relatively small subset of mechanisms that we can use for channeling energy from ultimately from the sunshine through photosynthesis and then finally eating ourselves. We use very similar mechanisms for changing, converting, channeling that energy. And any kind of pesticide, any kind of antibiotic, any kind of mechanism that we would use to disrupt those basic life processes are ultimately going to hurt a lot more than just the target species. And
well, so go back to this thing about the soil. Are there people who are concerned about making sure that the soil has the right bacteria? I know that there are people interested in the soil and in fungi and things like that, but I haven't heard of people who are worried about whether or not there are too many antibiotics being excreted onto a pasture and that it might be doing some lasting harm. What about that? Are antibiotics long living or permanent? And if you get them into an environment, do they just keep on killing everything they come across, or what?
Well, again, these are great questions and they're complicated. There are many different kinds of antibiotics, and ultimately a lot of our antibiotics were derived from nature, just like everything else. You may have heard that penicillin was originally derived from the Penicillium fungi. And so what we're doing is we're finding natural things that are going on out there. We know that just like we have our immune system, we know that, for example, many plants are toxic. And yet there's always going to be insects that can eat the most toxic plant because they have developed the ability to resist that particular toxin or to detoxify it. And so if we want to come up with a strategy for making ourselves safe from those same toxins, we sometimes will go to the insects and we'll try to figure out what metabolic pathways they have developed to avoid the risk there. So yeah, the point is like everything else, the nature of the bacterial flora of the soil, the presence of natural as well as artificially made antibiotics in the soil, that's an important area that I think you'd be pleased about with the number of people who are researching that now. There are plenty of soil scientists as well as other agricultural scientists who are very focused now on trying to define what a healthy soil ecosystem is and how human activity could alter that environment, and then to work on ways of developing better farming practices so that we maintain the health of the soil. Obviously, if we destroy the soil or if we even reduce how healthy it is, we're going to pay the price in the long run.
Okay, excellent. Now, when I was doing this Googling of you, I saw something that you're connected with an invertebrate zoology museum at Harvard. What's that all about? Well, and what would they do what kind of research would go on in connection with a zoology or a museum of any kind?
Okay. Well, museums, of course, are mostly, they will have a public face. You can go to the Royal Ontario Museum there close to you, a wonderful museum, and it's got a very strong public outreach component. And that's what most people are familiar with. But actually, it's sort of like an iceberg. The primary bulk of a museum is usually devoted to doing research.
Mhm.
For example, I study caddisflies, an aquatic insect, and I used to always turn to the world's probably leading authority on caddisflies for a long time was a fellow there at the Royal Ontario Museum. So museums are places where people do science, and we collect organisms not just to collect them and put them on the mantle, but we collect them so that we can study them. We also realize that we may collect something in 1850, for example, at Harvard, we have collections that go back into the 1840s. And we can actually, by looking at those things and seeing the differences between what they were like then and what they're like now, we can actually look at what changes were taking place in the environment. The museum I'm talking about at Harvard is called the Museum of Comparative Zoology. It's one of several natural history museums at Harvard, and it has been around for over 150 years. Scientists scouring the globe for different kinds of organisms, taking some samples to try to maintain so that we can have them to study. And we do have, in fact, some things that are now extinct or whose populations are now threatened. And we're able to go back because we have those collections, we can go back and study them. Another thing is you may have a specimen sitting on the shelf for 100 years that we really couldn't do much with for the 100 years, but then we come into this new era of genomics, and now we can take something that was preserved in alcohol even 100 years ago, and we can still isolate DNA from them, and we can determine things about the nature of that particular population. So those are the kinds of things we do. My work at Harvard, I've been actually at Harvard for about 25 years. And so I live down in Georgia, but I spend a lot of time in Boston. My job there is curating all of the parasite specimens, all of the parasitic invertebrates. So worms, arthropods like ticks and so on, any kind of animal that will infect other animals and cause disease. That's my work. And
you're into worms, good. Because one of my friends, who's an entomologist and in the forestry department, told me something that intrigued me. She said that worms are not native to Canada. They're an invasive species in Canada. Now, I did get to question her thoroughly on this subject because to me, an invasive species is something you don't want. I don't know whether she wants it or not, but I've always been told that the earthworm is your best friend. He's squirming around there, aerating the soil and leaving castings that fertilize things, or I don't know what they do, but we're supposed to be very thankful for our worm friends. And I wonder if that's true, or as a fervent Canadian, am I supposed to attempt to exterminate the worm?
Okay. I would say generally no. For one thing, the topic we were just on, that there are friendly things and then there are problematic things. Worms in general, she would have been undoubtedly talking about a particular worm or a particular group of worms. There are invasive earthworms that we're quite concerned about in North America these days. But one of the main reasons we're concerned about them, the same as invasive mollusks, is that invasive species will often dominate over our native species. That's just sort of a general truth. And the reason being that the native species often have a lot of natural enemies, predators, and so on that they have had to deal with. And many times, like if we introduce something from Asia, its natural predators are not here. And so it has that major advantage over our native populations. So she was probably talking about that. There are some invasive earthworms that have come into North America recently, and we are quite concerned about them. But worms in general are definitely native to just about every land environment except Antarctic.
I thought she was saying something like that the ice age, the glaciers had sort of scoured the soil and swept away the earthworms or something. So I really didn't know, but at any rate, we don't have a general policy of yes, earthworms are good or no, earthworms are bad for Canada. We have to look at the particular earthworm and whether it's an invader or not.
That's right. You've got to look at that and also the habitat. You also have earthworms are just terrestrial representatives of a large group called oligochaete annelids. Oligochaetes are actually not mostly terrestrial. Most oligochaetes, these are the relatives of earthworms, most of them are aquatic. So if you go and you start raking out muck from the bottom of Lake Ontario or from any of the beautiful rivers around there, you're going to find lots of annelids. Many of them are microscopic, never grow beyond microscopic size. Others you can see with your naked eye, but they're there. But they're all very important, very much a part of normal, healthy ecosystems. Same thing out in the ocean. If you move out into the ocean, where I work along the coast of Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, you're going to find in the coastal marine waters, you'll find another whole set of annelids. And there you get into not only the oligochaete annelids, but another group called the polychaete annelids, which are major parts of coastal marine ecosystems. So if you're dealing with one particular worm, trying to kill it, you're probably not going to be able to do that without doing damage to some of these other things that have been there from the beginning of time, and are very much a part of the healthy environment.
Okay, so I'm not out in my garden killing worms anyway, but it would be quite a project. I don't know how I would approach.
Well, we garden. My wife and I garden, and we love it. And I'm one of these. We don't tend to spray a lot of stuff. If there's a Japanese beetle, another invasive there, eating our beans, sometimes we just let them go. But we can take them off, or we can smash them, or something like that. But I'm not a real fan of just spraying things down. I just think it does too much damage to other things.
Yeah. I've been talking yesterday. I was talking to somebody about biostimulants. Apparently, they can make something out of seaweed that you spray on plants, and it makes them go gangbusters. Do you know about that? I mean,
no,
should I go buy a few bottles of it?
I'm not familiar with that, but that's great. I will go. I'll look it up. I'll go to Google myself. I'll look that up. I'm not familiar with that. I'm very familiar with the idea of using seaweeds as food, and of course, we've been doing that for a long time. Not only food to eat, but for additives to food to make food better, more palatable. One of the ways we get the nice head on their beer is the extract from some of the brown algae, the marine algae. So because marine algae grow so rapidly and convert energy so quickly from sunshine into a consumable status for us, I'm certain that learning better ways to cultivate and harvest seaweed is going to become a big part of feeding the planet in the future.
Well, I agree. These days, one of my enthusiasms for the week is, what's the story about the seaweed and what's our future? I'm very interested in it. But now you probably got me going on snails or oysters. Next week it'll all be about oysters. This has been fun. I appreciate it very much. And that's the beauty of running these conversations. I have never any idea what we're going to talk about, but it always turns out to be so interesting because I get such good people. So thank you. I appreciate this.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, a joy, and feel free to call on me at any time, and I'll be happy to share with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 495. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post transcripts there. And when you get there, look around. We have conversations going on there and people posting stuff about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser And in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.